Okay, well, good afternoon. I've got to go very quickly, all right, since I always prepare more than I have time to go through. So I'm going to move through this at a rapid pace. You have most of the slides in front of you, and we'll have some time for questions, and then afterwards we'll have a panel. First, let me say, most of my work is focused on how and ways to reduce recidivism. I deal mostly with the deeper end kids that end up in the system, end up in facilities, end up in programs. I'm not an expert in prevention or in even policy, although obviously some of this work has some implications. Most of this work centers around what we call evidence-based practices. That's a term everyone uses today. Everyone claims they're evidence-based. No one says, I don't know where the hell I got this program from. I want folks to understand there are different forms of evidence. The lowest form is anecdotal evidence, opinions, testimonials, case studies. It's what we rely on, really. It gets us through the work week. If you work with a youth, if the judge sentences a youth to some program and the youth does well and the family comes in and thanks him, he feels good about that decision. That's anecdotal evidence. It's not the same as empirical evidence. That's results from controlled studies, data. Doesn't always make us feel good. No one gets excited when I say there's a statistically significant difference at the 0.05 level. The research, and I'm not going to be able to go through it, but there's a large body of research that's really been developed probably over the last 30 years or so that says that we can reduce recidivism rates for youthful offenders, but not all programs are equally effective. If it was that simple, then I could just say go out and do some good things and you'll be fine. But the most effective programs are based on some principles. The risk principle, the need principle, the treatment principle, and the fidelity. Who to target, what to target, how to do it, and how well we do it all makes a big difference. Start with risk. Risk says target youth with a higher probability of recidivism. Basically, we want to focus on those kids that are most likely to continue to get in trouble. And it's a simple way to think about it. If half of the kids that come out of your state facilities never come back again, which half are we worried about? We're worried about the half that will. Okay? Second, of course, is we want to provide most intensive treatment to the higher risk youth. And we've got this finding that says if we provide too much intervention to lower risk youth, we can in fact increase failure rates. This is what a sample looks like, just so you know. This is a sample of youths to provide to the community. Low risk youth fail at about 9%. If you have 100 low risk youth, about 9 or 10 will recidivate. We're not going to get that much lower, by the way. On the other end of the scale, we have high-risk kids. About 60% will recidivate. That's really the group we want to put most of our efforts. In terms of how much treatment, over the years there hasn't been a lot of research in this area. Most of it's focused on time in treatment. How much time do you keep someone in? Most studies show the longer people are in treatment, the greater the effects. But there's a caveat. If you keep them too long, effects start to go down because people give up. People give up. Some new research, and we've been doing some of this in Ohio. These are the rules of thumb. About 100 hours for moderate risk will get you your effect. But for high risk, you have to think about doubling it. And the important finding there is that about 100 hours will really have no effect for higher risk kids. One of my big observations from doing this work for many years is that many programs are in fact one size fits all. We put kids in, we give them all basically the same programming, and then we wonder why we don't get much effect. This is some data out of Ohio, and basically what we found was for moderate risk, increasing the dosage of treatment did not have much effect. You got a little bit of an effect. But increasing the dosage of treatment for high risk reduced recidivism from 81% in this case to 57%. It had a fairly dramatic effect. The third element of the risk principle says if you put low-risk kids into intensive intervention, will often increase failure rates. And these are the reasons we think this happens. You're exposing them to high-risk kids. And I always ask the question, how many of you would put your 14 or 15-year-old in with a group of high-risk gang members or drug users, right? Most of us would. We do it all the time. I'm afraid to say the juvenile justice system. We put kids in detention for a week to teach them a lesson, and we're putting them in fact, often with higher-risk kids. It's not the only reason, though. When you take low risk and you put them in intensive programs, you often disrupt what makes them low risk. Most of us don't want our kids hanging around with someone who just got out of the detention facility or a program. So those are the reasons. We saw that very clearly in Ohio when we did a study in 2005. You could see for low-risk kids, when we put them in and kept them in the community, they failed at the rates we expected, about 8%. But when we put them in a residential program, they failed at, in this case, 2.5 times. For moderate risk kids, when we put them in institutions, we doubled their recidivism rate. It wasn't until we got down to the very high-risk kids that we started to see some effect, because they needed the structure and they needed the program. The second principle is the need principle. And really, in my opinion, this is where a lot of us go wrong in programming. We focus on areas of people's lives that, while they're in need, aren't necessarily correlated with criminal or delinquent behavior. And so the risk principle basically says focus on those areas that are highly correlated with criminal conduct. Things like antisocial attitudes, values and beliefs, cognitive emotional states. If self-identity, for example, if you see yourself as a thug or a gang member, how are you going to act? Like a thug or a gang member. Right? Attitudes, how you see the world, how you see your behavior. Do you accept responsibility? Do you blame others? Right? We hear it all the time, right? I was at the wrong place at the wrong time. The some dude defense. Some dude told me I could drive that car. We're looking for some dude. We haven't caught him yet. But if we do, crime's all the way down. Right? Pro-criminal associates, we all know this. Your mothers knew this. If you're a parent, you know. You worry about who your children hang around with. But it's not just having bad friends. It's not having pro-social people in their lives. And so you have to look at the other side of that coin. Not just who do they get in trouble with, but who is in their life that they don't get in trouble with. Temperament, personality patterns, impulsivity, adventurous, restlessly aggressive, being egocentric, okay? Having a lack of problem-solving skills and coping skills. These kids get into situations and they don't know how to get out. And they do what they always did. And of course that often leads to trouble. Okay? And a history of antisocial behavior. Family factors that include things like criminality, and low levels of caring and cohesiveness, poor parental supervision, and of course outright neglect and abuse. Low levels of education, vocational or financial achievement, low levels of involvement in pro-social leisure activities, and substance abuse. But I want to be really clear about this. Most of us who study offender behavior believe that these four run through these four. These are the big four right here. These are the ones that correctional programs really have to focus on if they want to get some effects. These are not criminogenic needs, by the way. I just show you that what we do doesn't always focus on these kind of areas. Here's one dance program that gets juveniles moving on the right track. I'll read you what it says. It says, there in a secure concrete area, young male offenders dance their way toward a new outlook on life. The good news is they're dancing to the music of Tupac, 50 Cent, and R. Kelly. So that's role models. Here's one, drum circles. They introduced it, again, here's what it says. They introduced the first drum circle in a New Zealand prison. She describes it as wow. That's the data they have right there. Wow. The staff was amazed because most clients continue drumming for 2 hours without stopping to smoke. And here they are, right here. They're drumming their way out of delinquent behavior. Here's one, juvenile sentenced to Shakespeare. And my favorite, handwriting formation therapy aims to reform juveniles in Texas. This woman, if you fax her your juvenile's handwriting, she will tell you how to fix them. She doesn't have to meet them. She got mad at me. She wrote me a letter the other day and actually wanted me to know she's had 100% success rate. So she has no failures with the handwriting. To meet the risk and need principle, and you heard the judge mention it, you really need to do good assessment. That's a challenge in a state like Michigan because you are a decentralized state. We have the same problem in Ohio. We have 88 counties, 88 juvenile courts, and they all pretty much do what they want to do. A few years ago, the